Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly 10-minute fix of ancient warfare-related ranting and musing by me, where I attempt to answer a question from a reader, viewer, or listener. You can send me a question, you can comment on a previous video or podcast, you can send me a postcard, you can send me an email, murray@caravanseraipublishers.com, or AWA@caravanseraipublishers.com, even AWA@ancientwarfare.com, I believe. It will get to me. You can even send an email to someone else and it'll eventually make its way to me. Now, today's question, I'm not sure. I think it might be from Ralph. I'm not sure. I didn't write it down, but it's a peculiar one and an interesting one nonetheless, and has sent me on a deep dive, which I do love. You, of course, can back us on Patreon as well, one of three different levels: Legionary, Optio, and Centurion. The question today is, I would like to pose a question for Murray about war pigs, burning and otherwise. What is the evidence they really were used in battle against elephants? And if so, how often, and were they really successful, or just when Antigonus II Gonatas used them at the siege of Megara? Okay, war pigs. Now, war pigs come up often. There's rules for war pigs in many war games, which is very odd because they're so peculiarly rare that the fact that they've been latched onto is odd. And the fact is that there are several other peculiarly rare items of ancient warfare that are not latched upon to in the same way as war pigs. For instance, we get talk of a flamethrower used in the Peloponnesian War. No one's talking about ancient Greek flamethrowers and, oh yes, my phalanx, I've got a flamethrower, which would be logical in a similar way that war pigs are developed as a weapon. Okay. Now, the other thing, of course, is that war pigs, and especially flaming pigs, are peculiarly anti-elephant weapons, not any other kind of weaponry, which we'll get to, and we'll go through the sources in a minute. And we're not talking about the Black Sabbath. Is it Black Sabbath? I think it's Black Sabbath song, War Pigs. I think so. That's an entirely different topic of conversation. If I'm funky, I could have that as the soundtrack going on to this actual podcast, but I'm not that skilled. Anyway, War Pigs. So the funny thing about these creatures is that, and we'll start with the example of Antigonus that you brought up. They're mentioned by Polyaenus of Macedon. Now, I'm a great fan of Polyaenus of Macedon. I wrote a master's thesis on him and his Stratagemata, or stratagems of war. He tends to get ignored, except when he's not. And he wrote, 900 stratagems in the 2nd century AD, and they tend to get plundered for their historical evidence rather than their stratagemic evidence as a work of didactic military literature, which is what I think they are. I don't object to them being plundered for their historical information, and sometimes Polyaenus is the only source that survives in any detail. The Battle of Chaeronea, for instance, Polyaenus is essential for understanding what happened in that battle. However, at the siege of Megara, according to Polyaenus, this is Book 4, Chapter 6, Number 3, the siege of Megara, Antigonus brought his elephants into the attack, but the Megarians daubed some swine with pitch, set fire to it, that should be set fire to them, surely, and let them loose among the elephants. The pigs grunted and shrieked under the torture of the fire and sprang forwards as hard as they could among the elephants, who broke their ranks in confusion and fright and ran off in different directions. From this time onwards, Antigonus ordered the Indians, that is his mahouts of the elephants, that when they trained their elephants to bring up swine among them, so that the elephants might thus become accustomed to the sight of them and to their noise. Now, that is an aphraxis on, generally one that goes back to the fact that horses and cavalry could not abide the smell or the sounds of camels. So it's kind of linked to that. And of course, the idea of getting war animals, whether it be horses or camels or elephants in this case, accustomed to noise of battle, it sort of ties into all of that. However, the idea of a burning pig being let loose amongst elephants sort of is the one that's been seized upon, and it's got a remarkably long history. And so here it is, Antigonus II Gonatas, and that's 265, 3rd century BC. However, what you start to find is other mentions of them, which are not in our main historical sources of battles, but in some really quite liminal ones on the outsides of that. So we find them not only in Polyaenus, but we find them in Aelians on animals. Whether this is the same Aelian who wrote the tactical manual is debated. I don't think it is, but it's a very interesting source anyway. I think it's the Aelian who wrote the Varia Historia, but we'll get to that's a completely different podcast, that one. All right, so what you have in Aelians on animals, two passages. One is in Book 1, Chapter 38, where he says, the elephant has a terror of the horned ram and of the squealing pig. It was by these means, they say, that the Romans put to flight the elephants of Pyrrhus of Epirus, and that the Romans won a glorious victory. This same animal is overcome by beauty in a woman and lays aside its temper, quite stunned by the lovely sight. This is very King Kong-esque there. And at Alexandria in Egypt, they say an elephant was the rival of Aristophanes of Byzantium for the love of a woman who was engaged in making garlands. The elephant also loves every kind of fragrance and is fascinated by the scent of perfumes and of flowers. Okay, so there it's not a burning pig, it's a squealing pig. And there it's not Antigonus Gonatas, but it is the Romans using it against the elephants of Pyrrhus of Epirus, which of course implies the battles of Heraclium and Beneventum. That's not in the historical accounts of those battles. That's in Aelians on animals. So it's an interesting one there. The next chapter is in Book 16 of On Animals, where he brings that up again. In chapter 36, he says, I have stated earlier on that the elephant dreads a pig. I now wish to tell what happened at Megara, and the Megarians were besieged by Antigonus. So this is the Antigonus example. And the story I have to tell is as follows. When the Macedonians were pressing them hard, they smeared some pigs with liquid pitch, set a light to them, and let them loose amongst the enemy. Goaded with pain and shrieking because of their burns, the pigs fell upon the troop of elephants, driving them mad and throwing them into terrible confusion. So the elephants broke ranks and were no longer tractable in spite of having been trained since they were small, either because elephants by some instinct hate and loathe pigs, or because they dread the shrill and discordant sound of their voices. In consequence, those who train young elephants, being aware of this, keep pigs along with them, so it is said, in order that through herding together the elephants they may get to fear them less. Okay, now it's the same story, but the idea is that they are, in this version, they are already trained, rather than in Polyaenus' version, which is you should train them in the future. So there's sort of a combination there. And it's weird because these sources talk about the fear of pigs and the horned ram, no mention of mice, whereas in modern ideas about what elephants are afraid of, it's mice, not pigs. So you could easily see a cartoon with Porky Pig and an elephant, and the elephant freaking out at Porky Pig. But no, that's not been done. It's always a mouse. Anyway, that's interesting. So you've got the two ideas. One is Pyrrhus of Epirus and one is Megara. Very few anecdotes, and these again I say are liminal rather than main historical sources. Now, we do get a historian talking about the use of pigs against elephants, and this is remarkable because it comes from the 6th century against when the Persians besieging the city of Edessa, and the Romans are defending it against the Persians. Now, interestingly, in Persian sieges, and this goes all the way back to the 4th century, Ammianus Marcellinus talks about elephants coming up against city walls at not Amida, but at Nisibis. And so you got the Persians using elephants in siege, besieging cities, just like Antigonus against Megara. Now, in chapter, what are we at? We are in, I can't find it. We are in Book 8, Chapter 14, subsection 36. A single elephant is brought up against the wall, and he says that it seems that the elephant was, in fact, an engine for the capture of cities. The Romans, however, by suspending a pig from the tower, escaped this peril. For as the pig was hanging there, he very naturally gave vent to sundry squeals, and this angered the elephant so that he got out of control, and stepping back little by little, moved off to the rear. Such was the outcome of this situation. So it's not a burning pig in this case, it's just a squealing pig, which is putting off the elephant. Now, in all of these cases, the idea that a pig can't be brought down by archers or javelineers whilst it's causing this chaos is very peculiar. And it's how this tradition has lasted as long. So in this case, you've got, 6th century AD versus the stories from the 3rd century BC. And it's a really interesting perpetuation of that idea. Nothing in between, however. And even when they put them on Pyrrhus of Epirus, that's still 3rd century BC, 275, 280, 275, Megara, 265. So it's a really interesting length of time that you get between these examples, and that's it. So the fact that we get them in war games is very odd indeed. So I think that that's about it for the evidence of the pig, the war pig, burning or otherwise. It's an interesting idea and not normally one mentioned, as I said, in our main sources about how do you deal with elephants. They normally are ineffable amount of shots. You create, like for scythed chariots, you create avenues through your own ranks to allow the elephants to pass through, and if possible with sticky things, spears normally, or javelins, you turn them around and make them run into their own men rather than the enemy. So it's a really interesting one. And as I say, there are other very peculiar examples of weapons that don't get seized upon. For instance, Aeneas Tacticus talks about launching beehives or wasp nests into the enemy. We don't get that as a rule in warfare, in ancient war games, for instance. But you could quite easily. So I hope that answers your question, whether it was from Ralph or someone else, about war pigs. And join me again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers.